Hi, as Simon mentioned, my name's Andrew. I work as a CTO in residence for Microsoft for startups in Sydney, which is of course why I'm in Melbourne. It totally makes sense. I actually just came for some fresh air. But CTO in residence is a weird title, Simon mentioned it. It's really just a fancy way of saying that I get to help out startups. Generally what I get to do is work with their technical organizations, and I've found something from working with dozens, probably topping 100 startups now, that it doesn't matter what stack they're using, whether it's artisanal, handcrafted VMs, which of course I counsel them might not be the best idea, or maybe it's full disaster Kubernetes, also fun. But there's one thing that's consistent across any stack that I've seen a startup using, and that's the thing that really concerns them most is actually not their stack, but people management. And so I kind of had this idea kind of early on in my time with working with startups, and so I did a survey earlier this year, and I asked startups, their CTOs and VPs, senior technical leaders, to rank their concerns, what kept them up at night. And so what we see here is a visualization of this ranking, and we can see that people management comes out on top, generally by a pretty wide margin. Then we go through planning, resilience, recruiting, security, operations, development process, and deployment. You might also notice that there is an interesting squishy, people-y thing towards the top and a more technically thing down the bottom. And I don't think that's actually a coincidence. I think underlying everything that we do, people underlie the work we do. And often we get obsessed with the technical and chief technical officer, or the engineering and vice president engineering, or whatever it is, and we don't actually think about the people. But really, they underpin everything we're doing. Now, if you work for a startup and you don't agree with these results, or you do agree with these results, the survey is still open. If you would like, you can head off to this URL. I'm at 97 responses, and I desperately want to be able to say we surveyed 100 startups and this was the results. So if we could get 3 more startups to submit to the survey, that would be wonderful. But this talk used to be called Everything I Know About Teams I Have Learned from Computers, which is glib and not quite true. But it kind of gives you an idea of, it's kind of been the computers that have taught me a lot about how to work teams. And it's probably worth, at this point, running through a little bit of a better introduction of myself and some of the work I've done. So I worked for years as a developer. Some of you might know me from my time as a developer. I was an individual contributor. So I had my time as that young idealistic developer, you probably have one on your team, who railed against management and generally caused problems. That was me. I like to think I've matured a little bit since then. There's probably some people who could tell you whether that's true or not. And I've worked in big companies, I've worked in small companies, I've worked in successful startups, I've worked in startups that have gone down in flames. But somewhere along the way, I found myself leading tech for a startup. And at first it was pretty easy because it was just me and the founders. And that was fine. But all of a sudden I found myself managing a team. And I found like I was out of my depth. I wasn't able to just sit and code. That was what I was used to doing. I was no longer able to kind of just obsess over the product even, because I actually had to care about the people who were making the product. And if I'm honest, there was one kind of overarching anxiety that was kind of playing on my mind, and it was I going to turn into this guy? was I going to become a guy who leans against the partition? Side note, I watched this film and it rails against cubes, and I long for a cubicle. But that's a whole different issue. But I was no longer equipped from years of self-teaching, because that was how I became a developer, or any kind of formal education in how to lead, motivate, manage anything, these people that were building our products. And I suspect that's probably not a tremendously new story for a lot of people in the room. We've kind of graduated from engineering into engineering management and maybe not really had the greatest progression through there. And so I want to introduce you to this idea, and it's called the Peter Principle. Has anyone else heard of the Peter Principle? Good, it's a good one to know. It was first posited in the 60s, and is really easily distilled as people are promoted to their level of incompetence. And it's a really common thing when your only way up in an engineering role, your only way to get promoted is actually to swing across into management. And there was a study last year which actually empirically proved out the Peter Principle in a sales organization, but I think we can borrow it and look at it for an engineering organization as well. And it showed that those people who had a greater level of sales aptitude actually had lower management aptitude. So here are some graphs. Don't worry too much about them. It just shows that there is a predicted, so this is the prediction. They are predicting based on some interviews and some things. You can actually read the paper. There's the source down the bottom. They predicted that as sales performance increased, then the probability of promotion also increased. It's fair enough, you promote your high performers. The problem was that promotion was into management, and there was a negative correlation predicted based on some psychometrics and that kind of thing between the sales performance and the management aptitude of these individuals. You can see the problem. And so they came back and they had a look, and when they actually looked, yes, this was exactly the case. So they went and looked at these managers and looked at some metric for their marginal manager value added, whatever that means. But basically, are they a good manager or not? And you can see the bottom tercile of sales performers are the best managers, according to this metric, and the top tercile are the worst managers. And this actually ends up often being the case in terms of engineering as well, because we can become very good engineers. We can become very focused on the technical parts of what we do, but transferring those skills across into management, into people, it's a fundamentally different problem. And I thought about this, and why is it this so fundamentally different? I think part of the problem that we face is that people do not throw stack traces. They don't have helpful error messages when things are going wrong. What happens is that they silently error, and performance degrades, and then they segfault and leave. And so we as technologists on the whole don't have a great reputation for plays well with others, you know, that section on the report card. And we're often given a free pass because we do weird things with weird text editors and things kind of come out the other end. But I don't think it's fair to the people we work with, or even fair to us, to allow ourselves to ignore the dynamics of the teams that we lead or the teams that we work inside. And so I thought today we might spend some time getting to know our teams and the dynamics within them using something that's near and dear to my heart, which is distributed systems theory. It's logical. And so I thought we'd start off by defining distributed systems. And so here we go. At a conference like this with relatively technical people, I think we're fairly safe on distributed systems, but just a couple of reminders. Distributed systems basically mean that we have a distribution of state and processing in our system. And so we encounter them even when we don't acknowledge that we're really dealing with them. So if you have a fancy progressive web app, you know, with the fun React front end and whatever you've got on the back end, you have a distributed system. You have separated state and processing between your browser and your back end. Even if you have a monolithic back end, you have a distributed system and all of the state-ridden problems that come with it. Lucky you. But there are a few distributed systems that we might not be aware of, and I'm going to graze across one which is my favorite. Did you know that your brain is in fact a distributed system? This is called the human connectome, and it's a graph of all of the different connections inside the brain. You'll see a really fun red section in between the two hemispheres of the brain. That's called the corpus callosum. There used to be a surgery where surgeons would actually sever that corpus callosum, effectively causing a net split in the brain. And you can survive having your corpus callosum severed, but what we actually discovered, that was a treatment for epilepsy. Turns out it's not a tremendously effective treatment for epilepsy, but it did teach us a whole lot of interesting things about the brain and the fact that these two hemispheres are communicating with each other, and they actually have disjunct memory space and all of this kind of stuff. But you came here for distributed systems, you came here for teams, not for neuroscience. There is a link there if you want to read up about it. It's really fascinating. There's a couple of papers that actually prove out that yes, the brain is a distributed system. But let's get back to our definition. I'm going to borrow from a gentleman called Sukumar Ghosh and his aptly titled book, Distributed Systems. And he defines distributed systems as having 4 key properties. And so we're going to look at our teams and see if our teams possess these 4 properties and if we can proceed with this talk assuming that, yes, our teams are distributed systems. So the first thing that we're looking for is multiple processes. Now, if you've got a team, that probably means you have multiple people working on your product. So that's a fairly easy one. What we're looking for as well is inter-process communication. We at least hope that the people on your team are talking to one another and communicating with one another as they build this product. So we're probably okay on that one. The third property that we're looking for is disjoint address space. Each person who's working on your team has their own understanding of what they're working on, their own kind of accumulation of state. I think that's fairly fair to say. And the fourth thing is a collective goal. Hopefully we all are working towards the same thing. If you don't have a collective goal, then you probably have bigger problems. Are we all kind of okay with the idea that, according to this definition, our team is a distributed system? Cool. No one said no yet. That's really good, because otherwise it's a really short talk. So we could think about given that we're relatively agreed that this is a distributed system that we're dealing with, we could deal with all of the properties of a distributed system. We could talk about scaling dimensions and all of that, and that's really interesting. But I also really like looking at what distributed systems are not, and what properties do not hold true for distributed systems. And there's actually a piece of really interesting work that came out of Sun Microsystems. You might be familiar with it. It's called The 8 Fallacies of a Distributed System. Now, basically what the 8 fallacies are is a documentation of a series of false assumptions that we can often bring to a distributed system, which causes us to basically build bad distributed systems. And in our cases, as technical leaders, it's the false assumptions that we bring to our teams. And it means that we can fail to scale our teams effectively. We create conflict within our teams. And so hopefully by looking at these 8 fallacies, we can learn some things that we can apply to our teams so that we can architect them better, so that we can optimize them, and we can have better output. And so we're going to crack into them. And the first fallacy that we often come into, and it probably is the most damaging sometimes, is that the network is reliable. In a network, we're kind of familiar with the idea that not every message sent is going to be received, or received within a reasonable time frame. And similarly with people, not everything you or someone else says is necessarily going to be heard. Not every email you send is going to be read. Some instant messages, some Slack messages are going to get lost in the mass of notifications. And so even with our best teams, our communication is not going to be 100% reliable. And this becomes even more true when you're scaling up your teams, because as you're scaling, things are moving and things get missed. And so knowing this, what we need to do is we need to compensate for it. We need to architect with this in mind. We need to choose the right mediums for the right messages. And sometimes it might mean we need to be a little bit more TCP than UDP. We need to make sure that the message has been received, and try again if it hasn't, and try again if it hasn't. It's a bit chatty, it's a little bit slower, but at least you know when you've been heard. The second fallacy that we come across is that latency in our distributed system is 0. If you've ever waited for a reply to an email or an instant message, or you've waited for someone to finish a task, then you've experienced this kind of working latency within your team. And sometimes it doesn't matter. Sometimes it's fine. But sometimes it really does matter and something gets blocked. Or sometimes it means that you have a race condition and conflicting work gets done. And so it's our responsibility as technical leaders to manage this latency in our distributed systems. And that's true of our teams as well. We have to design things so that the impact of this latency is minimized. We have to have ways of raising up an exception if someone is in a deadlocked state, or if there's a race condition, or if there's conflict resulting from a race condition. We need to architect with this in mind because it will happen. The third fallacy that we deal with is that bandwidth is infinite. And we all know there's only so much we can get done at once, and you can only get so much done in a week or a month or a sprint or whatever, and our backlogs are overflowing and we know that, but that's not really what this is about. What I'm talking about here is that no matter how hard I try, the communication bandwidth between you and I is finite. I have a whole lot of ideas about this topic in my head, but using the joy of words, I can only ram so much down this pipe into your brain. There is no Vulcan mind meld where I can perfectly communicate what I want to say. And this problem is compounded by media. So in a one-to-one conversation, I probably have my best chance of getting as much of my thoughts across to someone. But if we change media, say we go to a video conference, we've lost some fidelity and we've lost some bandwidth. So we've lost some subtlety, there's distraction, there's, if you're using NBN, there's probably some lag. Every talk needs an NBN joke. And then if we downgrade to audio, if we have a phone call or a phone conference, then you don't get my facial expressions, you don't get my gesticulations, and suddenly you've lost even more information. And if we go down to email or text message, then almost all of the nuance and context is lost. And when less is communicated directly, what happens, what do we do as humans, is we infer. We start to layer on our own understanding and we start to make assumptions. And that becomes problematic because we might be layering incorrect assumptions. We might be making incorrect inferences on what someone else is communicating. And so we have to understand the implications of lower bandwidth media. We have to make trade-offs, and sometimes we might need to upgrade it. This is especially true when we have remote teams, or even more with distributed teams. We've got to sometimes work out when it's important to get everyone in the same room so that we can have those high bandwidth communications. And sometimes we can use those occasions to build up context so that it can be correctly inferred when we're using a lower bandwidth medium. The fourth fallacy that we have to deal with, I've had to twiddle with a little bit. Traditionally, it is that the network is secure. But we're going to assume for the moment that everyone on your team is working with the best of intentions. And I think that's a base assumption that you need to come with. If you can't assume that as a base assumption, then I think there's some work to do. And so we're going to start with that. And we're going to assume that your network is secure. So what we're going, which, if we're talking about fallacies, seems like a problem. But what we're going to do is what we can't assume is that the information transmitted across your network between the people on your team is transmitted accurately. If you've ever played a game of telephone or Chinese whispers or whatever you want to call it, where one person tells another person a message, 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 and then out the other side is a completely garbled sentence which has no relation to the original sentence. And that happens within our teams. And so that means two things for us. The first thing is we actually need to bubble up to that first assumption. We need to truly start with the base assumption that everyone is trying their best. Start there. Because otherwise, when we miscommunicate, and we are going to miscommunicate, we've already had 3 fallacies that have told us we're going to miscommunicate, things are going to go downhill fast if your base assumption isn't that people are doing their best. Now, the second thing that we need to take when we're dealing with a network that doesn't transmit information correctly is that we need to ensure that what we think we have said has been heard. And similarly, we need to ensure that what we think we have heard was actually said. And in a networking way, this is like using checksums. A checksum in the real world is called active listening. repeating back what's been said to you or some summary of it so that you can confirm what you have heard is actually what was said. And we need to engage in this in our teams, and we need to make sure that those important messages have been heard accurately. The fifth assumption, the fifth fallacy that we come to distributed systems with is that the topology doesn't change. As our companies grow, the topology necessarily changes. I work in a big company now. I have survived 4 reorganizations in 1 year. And I can tell you, topology is constantly changing because we're adapting to the problem set and how we understand it. And so we need to be intentional about this as we scale our teams. Suddenly middle management might be required. You might need to sort out the way you scale your teams into different ways. There's lots of people have talked about this a lot, but we need to be very intentional about these changes as we make them. The sixth fallacy is that there is one administrator. As we scale, as we change our topologies, we're going to find there's no longer a single owner for a piece of work or a piece of functionality. We're going to find that there are multiple stakeholders that need to be managed. And so what we need to move forward is consensus building. And if we've learned anything from distributed systems, it's that consensus protocols are quite hard. And there's no difference with humans. A lot of our roles as we move into technical leadership becomes not making decisions, but facilitating people to come together to make decisions together. Helping people come together and help people build consensus and drive forwards. Now, our seventh fallacy is that transport cost is zero. All of this communication has overheads. Communication has costs. And it doesn't mean it's not worthwhile, but we need to acknowledge it and we need to optimize our distributed systems, our teams, for that. We need to set up a balance between the cost of communication, the cost to get things done, and having enough people on that team to actually be able to deliver the work. And there's a classic mathematics problem which kind of illustrates this. It's called the handshake problem. So the question is, if everyone in this room were to shake hands with every other person in this room, how many handshakes would that take? And it's pretty easy for 2 people. For 2 people, that's 1 handshake. For 3 people, it's 3 handshakes. For 4 people, you've got 6 handshakes. 10 people, it's 45 handshakes. 100 people, you've got 4,950 handshakes to make. It gets out of hand pretty quickly, and that's because it's an exponential curve. That has to be taken into account as we work with our teams. How do we manage the boundaries of our distributed system? How do we find bounded contexts for people to work within? Just because communication has cost doesn't make it bad. We just need to understand that, and we need to optimize our structure to manage that overhead. Now, the final fallacy is that the network is homogeneous, or homogeneous, as some people like to say it. As you start out, especially in a startup, people tend to kind of be quite similar, and they tend to be very mission-driven. They tend to be deeply engaged. And as you grow, what happens is you pick up people who have different motivations. They have different ideas. They will have different desires, and their reasons for working for you or with you are going to be different. And they should have different backgrounds. They should have different perspectives. They should come from different communities. And this should be treated as a feature and not a bug. The more diverse a team is, and this is according to research, the more diverse a team is, the higher the cumulative intelligence of that group is. But these differences also tend to complicate things. They lead to misunderstandings. People are going to mess up. And so it's our job as technical leaders to help manage that, manage the interfaces, and get everyone on the same page. It's worth it, though, and it's especially worth it with small teams to optimize early and to work on that early, make sure you get it right. Because if you try and tack it on at the end, you're going to be in big trouble. Now, with a distributed system, I think there's one thing that we can generally agree which is not acceptable. And that is a single point of failure. Because suddenly your distributed system has turned into a modular monolith or some kind of monolith because you have a single point of failure. And the problem is, when we architect our teams, sometimes we architect them with a single point of failure built in. And that might be yourself as a CTO or a VP or some kind of senior technical leader where every decision is running through you. And that is a problem. It might be a principal engineer, or it might be your rockstar developer. And what I'm going to encourage you to do is, if you find yourself with this rockstar developer type person, that you need to re-architect your monolith. If you're relying on a rockstar developer, you are building a monolith. Don't do it. It is not going to scale over the long term. This person cannot scale with your company and will probably actually become a destructive influence. Rockstars don't scale. They create a single point of failure, and they will ultimately become a drag on your team. And the trick with rockstar developers is actually to transform them from being the guy with doing the lead guitar solo with his leg up on the speaker, kind of in his own world. I say he because often these particular types of developers are male. But to take this rockstar developer and transition them to being a jazz musician. I used to play a bit of jazz back in the day, and one of the most delightful things about watching a jazz ensemble play is if someone is soloing, everyone else is cheering them on. And jazz is all about listening and collaborating in real time with people. And there's one thing I specifically enjoy about jazz, and I'm going to borrow someone's joke because I just enjoy it so much. I shouldn't set up with I'm going to borrow someone's joke because now you're all waiting for the joke. But there's this thing that you might have seen with jazz and jazz musicians, and it's this idea of jazz face. It's the face that musicians make if they hear something really good. They hear someone who's soloing play something, oh yeah, that's good. And jazz face I've found best described as if you have smelled a fart, but it's kind of good. But you need to transition your rock stars into jazz musicians because that's how you move forward. That's how you have a collaborative team. That's how you move away from your monolith. So how do we scale our teams? How do we take our whole team and make them bigger and better? What are the practical things we have to do as leaders to be able to do this, as architects, if you will? And the first thing that we need to do is we need to have monitoring. We need to monitor the health of our teams. We need to identify fault conditions and remediate them quickly. That requires us to have our finger on the pulse. We need to ask questions of ourselves and of our team. Are we making the right trade-offs? Does the team know where we're going? Can they articulate the how, the what, but most importantly, the why of what they're doing? And this is where kind of one-on-one meetings become really essential for us as leaders, because they give us a direct line into the individuals in our team. Now, you can have tools for measuring things, but I think the thing that you've got to look for is those one-on-ones and those skip levels where you actually get down into the nitty-gritty of, do people really understand what's going on? We need to have a culture of communication, and we need to have time dedicated to discussing issues as they arise and working to resolve them proactively. And that brings us to conflict resolution. Like any distributed system, we are going to end up with some inconsistent state. We're going to need to deal with some conflicts. Because as we've said, people have different backgrounds, different experiences, different opinions. They come at things from different directions. And that means that we need to have a way to manage conflicts. We need to get people back on the same page when things get weird. And we can't be afraid of conflict. We can't run away from it or bury it. Because if we do that, what happens is it festers. And instead of being a little diversion, a little divergence, it becomes this big rift, this kind of merge conflict which we can never actually bring back into the main line, and we have to do something drastic. So a lot of this is about us as leaders creating a place of psychological safety, where it is okay to be wrong. Where getting there together is more important than being right, more important than being the smartest person in the room. I have a whole talk on psychological safety, but really, ultimately, as leaders, what it requires is to create a place where it's safe to create interpersonal risks. It's safe to take interpersonal risks, sorry. We need to make it safe for the team to come together and to work it out together. And that requires communication. In order to scale, we need people to make good decisions independently. To do that, we need context. That requires us to communicate as much context as we can as leaders. And that means we need to be as transparent as possible about what's going on and why we're doing things. That helps keep everyone on the same page, and it helps people know where they should be focusing their effort. But as we've said, communication has costs. And as leaders, it's actually going to cost us. Sometimes it is going to take us more energy to be transparent and explain and take people on the journey than it might feel to operate in a command and control fashion. But if we're acting in a command and control fashion, what we're doing is we're creating that monolith again. We're creating that single point of failure. So we need to scale our communication and distribute that context. It pays off. Now I have 2 slides on communication. That seems a bit redundant, and that's exactly the point. Sometimes you might feel like you're repeating yourself. But people miss things, and it's better to over-communicate those important messages rather than under-communicate. And I'll tell you what, in all of the companies that I've worked for, that I've worked with, I have never actually seen someone be able to over-communicate an important issue, an important message. And so I have some advice for you. If you feel like you have an important message and you feel like you have said it too many times and people are bored of it, can I give you a suggestion? Say it one more time, just to be sure. So I'm going to say this one more time, just to be sure. Make sure your team know the what, the how, and most importantly, the why of the things they're doing. Within reason, I would suggest that you should communicate what's concerning you, what's keeping you up at night, the things that are driving you. And you can use OKRs and that kind of thing to try and drive your team towards the right things. But in the end, it should always come back to the why. And then it should come back again. What's important here is clarity of roles. It turns out that we actually, as humans, determine or we plan our actions in the context of understanding what other people's goals are. So if we don't understand what someone else's goals are, we are going to end up tripping over that other person. And similarly, if someone doesn't understand what our goals are, they're going to end up tripping over us. And so the same thing happens in teams. We need to understand what someone's driving towards so we can help them or so we can get out of their way. What do they need to be successful? And so that requires us to know their goals. Similarly, if we want people to come alongside us, we need to be able to express our individual goals. And as leaders, what's important for us to do is to make sure that people understand who is leading a particular effort and who is driving it, because otherwise the ambiguity can lead to conflict. Either the tragedy of the commons or too many people trying to lead out a particular thing. So it's our job to try and scope that in. We need to reiterate collective goals. We need to point everyone to where we're going and why we're getting there. It's key to reiterate these goals because especially in technical teams, we can get bogged down in the minutiae of what we're doing and we can forget why we're going there at all. In the end, culture eats strategy for breakfast. When it comes down to it, the thing that is going to set you up to succeed is your culture. And you can do the Spotify model, you can do 2 pizza teams, you can do whatever you want. But in the end, culture is going to be the driving force towards your success. Culture is bigger than strategy because culture, in the end, will make or break your strategy. If things go big, they are going to scale beyond your individual control, and people are going to have to make decisions and have interactions unmediated by you. And the thing that is going to mediate those interactions and determine those decisions is going to be the culture that you have established. The best definition I've found for culture is that it is the collective character of a group. Our character seeps out through our pores as individuals, and similarly the same thing happens with our culture in our teams. In the end, it's about choices. Our culture is not built by having fancy culture and values decks or sessions or whatever it is. Flip, Enron had a fancy culture and values deck. They had really nice values on their wall, but it all came crumbling down. Culture is built through the decisions that we make. And I would like to borrow from a friend of mine. Her name is Jenny Herald, and she says this: culture is who we hire, who we fire, the behaviors we reward, and the behaviors we reprimand. In the end, it's about the choices we make, sometimes the hard choices that we make to create and define and defend a culture. So I would like to encourage you today, make good choices. There are 2 things that I want to leave you with. Build a team that has a diverse set of people and has a culture which allows those people to thrive. Make choices that might be hard at the time that pay off over the long term. Communicate where you're going. how you're getting there, and why you're going at all. There are so many parts to scaling a team, but if you get those two things right, you're well on your way. Thank you.